it's time for us to evaluate one of this weekend's many contests. This one's set to go down by way of Top Rank on ESPN. Mikaela Mayer versus Erica Farias. Current reigning WBO super featherweight champion Mikaela Mayer versus the former super lightweight champion of Argentina, Erica Farias. And I have to say that on the face of it, I don't think this is going to go well for Erica Farias. There's a multitude of reasons why. For starters,
inactivity.
Erica hasn't fought in close to 2 years. She hasn't fought since October of 2019 when she locked horns with Jessica McCaskill for the second time. And, she lost that fight. Since then, she has paired up with Chino Maidana Promotions over there in Argentina. And I half expected that Chino would have set something up for her so she could bounce back, rebound off the loss, but that just didn't happen. For one reason or another, Erica hasn't fought since October of 2019.
So ring rust is an issue.
I think it's an issue. I think it's going to be the night of the fight. You don't sit out for that long. You don't sit out for that duration of time, then decide you're going to try to rebound with someone like Mikaela Mayer, who's a very polished boxer, very educated jabber with a very strong corner.
You don't try to rebound with somebody like Mikaela Mayer.
That is just a bad idea all around for a fighter that has sat out the last 17 months. So while this might be very opportunistic for Mikaela, this is very ill-advised for Erica. So I think ring rust is going to be an issue. I think that Erica Farias' speed, her timing, and perhaps even her punch resistance is compromised as a result of all that inactivity. There's that to consider. There is the contracted weight of the match to consider. This is a super featherweight contest, 130 pounds. Erica Farias hasn't fought anywhere near this low since 2009. That's roughly 12 years ago. Now, don't get me wrong, she might look the part, very svelte, very aesthetically pleasing, though ultimately there's more to weight cuts than meet the eye, and we don't know what this weight cut will have done to Erica's ability to perform, her ability to absorb punches. She hasn't fought anywhere near this low in a long, long time.
Wonder if she's not drained making 130.
Because she might be. She has been fighting as a super lightweight, 140-pound fighter for years now. Those weight cuts can be brutal. It's conceivable that by the time this video is uploaded, both the fighters will have weighed in. And I don't even know that Erica's going to make 130 pounds. It wouldn't surprise me at all if she's a little over. And we find that out by the time that this video is uploaded. What you have to look out for is if Erica Farias actually makes 130 pounds, she could be weight drained as a result. And even if she's just a little over, even if she's over by a pound or 2 pounds, the same applies because Erica hasn't fought anywhere near this low in years. We'll get those answers in a few hours, perhaps by the time this video is uploaded. Better still, there are those things to consider. There are those things, but there is also the stylistic matchup. Erica Farias isn't a pressure fighter, you understand?
No.
That's not the kind of fighter that she is. This is the kind of fighter that likes to use their jab to set up the overhand right. I have to say, the overhand right, looping shot, that's Erica Farias' money punch. In Erica's last outing with Jessica McCaskill, she struggled to land that big right hand, that big looping right hand. And that was against an opponent that, for the most part, is coming forward, is stepping into striking distance of the big right hand, yet Erica failed to land it. We know that Jessica McCaskill's claim to fame is her engine and her pressure, not her defensive wizardry. And against a fighter that does have defensive lapses in judgment, Erica couldn't get off that big right hand. So with Mikaela Mayer, who's more statuesque than Erica,
and more defensively responsible than Jessica,
I'd wager that Erica Farias is going to struggle greatly to get off her shots. She's going to struggle greatly to land punches on Mikaela Mayer because, in a nutshell, if you couldn't get off that big right hand on Jessica McCaskill, who has an affinity for coming forward and crowding a fighter, if you couldn't successfully get off that looping right on Jessica, you're going to struggle even more to get it off on Mikaela. Mikaela, who's taller, I'd wager has a bit of a reach advantage, has a height advantage, and is more of a jabber. Mikaela Mayer's best punches are her straight punches. Her signature punch is, in fact, the jab, which sets up the straight right hand or the right cross.
Mikaela is more defensively responsible.
You know, Erica Farias was deducted a point in that last McCaskill fight for excessive holding. She resorted to clinching excessively whenever Jessica would step within striking distance of her. She couldn't deal with the volume. She's not going to have that option with Mikaela because I have no doubts Mikaela's going to stay behind her jab, stay behind the straight shots, and try to pick off Erica Farias long distance. Thus, clinching.
Yeah, Erica might not have that option.
Talking about a statuesque jabber with a height advantage, a reach advantage, who knows how to stick and move, doesn't just know how to use that lead hand, but also knows how to use those legs. Against a fighter who's been out for 17 months, was never all that fast to begin with. Decent-sized puncher, though will struggle to get off those shots. I mean, I see a situation where there could be a knockdown and there might even be a knockout. Because I reiterate, Erica Farias, if she makes 130 pounds, hasn't actually fought at that weight in a little over a decade.
She might be drained.
You know, it's for this reason that myself and several others view this Erica Farias fight for Mikaela Mayer as very opportunistic, very fortuitous, because given the circumstances, Erica Farias is tailor-made for Mikaela. Now, I understand that Erica Farias, at least the last couple of years, was one of the somebodies in the sport of women's boxing, but those days have long since passed. I mean, I understand that she's been in there with Delphine Persoon and Mary McGee and Cecilia Brækhus and Ana Laura Esteche, Jessica McCaskill 2 times. I understand that Erica Farias had a very respectable reign and a very respectable run as a fighter, but here today, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing that communicates to me that she can win this fight. The logical choice here, the obvious one, is Mikaela Mayer to win in any fashion. It could be Mikaela Mayer on points. It could very well be Mikaela Mayer by way of knockout or technical knockout as a result of the weight cut and what effect that's had on Erica, who hasn't fought in 17 months and hasn't fought anywhere near this low in a little over a decade. So I don't think that any of you out there listening to this video will be at all surprised to hear that I am going with Mikaela Mayer to successfully defend her WBO title in what is her first defense of it. And this is set to go down on the undercard of Inoue versus Das Marinas by way of Top Rank and ESPN. In reference to the main event of that same card, Inoue versus Das Marinas, where Inoue will be defending his 2 bantamweight titles. You know what really has my attention isn't the fight itself. I mean, I am going with Naoya Inoue to win, and I am going with him to win by way of knockout, as is customary with the monster. You know, but that doesn't have my attention. What really has my attention is that Nonito Donaire will be in attendance. He decided to pay his old buddy Naoya a visit. And you have to wonder that perhaps preliminary conversations aren't happening. You know, one of the reporters in this video, he asked Nonito, is there going to be a rematch? And Nonito quite playfully said yes, though I think there is some truth to that. Nonito's got options now that he's a champion again. He can so decide to see about fighting the winner of Casemiro versus Rigondeaux, or he can see about fighting his old buddy Naoya Inoue for a second time, as their first fight was a fucking barn burner. It was a hell of a matchup. Nobody gave Nonito a chance of finishing that fight on his feet. Nobody gave Nonito Donaire a chance to put up the fight that he did. We know that very recently Nonito was in action against the then unbeaten Nordine Bali, the then reigning WBC bantamweight champion, a fight that took place under the auspices of the PBC's high priest on PBC Island. And I've said it many times that Top Rank really dropped the ball not putting a bid in for that fight. Because if you're in the Naoya Inoue business, you then have to be in the business of his opponents. And they let that one get away from them. Tom Brown, which is just another way of saying Al Heyman, he ended up being the sole bidder for that fight when it went to purse bids. And as a result of that, it ended up on the PBC side of things, though I don't think Nonito Donaire has actually entered into any agreements, any contractual obligations with the PBC. The fight happened over there, but that don't make the fighters PBC fighters, I don't think. And I didn't find that at all encouraging. I didn't find it at all encouraging that Nonito Donaire versus Nordine Bali was happening under the PBC banner as opposed to the Top Rank banner. Though Nonito being in attendance for Naoya Inoue's fight, well, that's encouraging. That's a ray of hope. Things have gotten nowhere fast with John Riel Casimero, the reigning WBO Bantamweight champion, who's set to be in action very soon against Guillermo Rigondeaux in defense of that WBO title. And if I'm being honest, I'm not confident at all that Naoya Inoue gets to face the winner of that fight at any time in the near future. I mean, Sean Gibbons, who handles the career of John Riel Casimero, he seems quite content taking to social media to post GIFs and make snarky comments, snide remarks about Naoya Inoue, who's a consummate professional, doesn't do any trash talking himself. Sean seems quite content posting memes and GIFs and saying this and that about Naoya Inoue instead of seeing about making a goddamn fight. The only fight you decided to make was the Guillermo Rigondeaux fight. The hell you so worried about Naoya Inoue for if you're set to be fighting someone else? They spend more time talking about Naoya Inoue than the guy they're actually going to be fighting.
Talking about the guy they're actually going to be fighting.
And these are just games. These are just games. Fucking games. Childish games. When I see Nonito Donaire is actually in attendance for Naoya Inoue's fight, it gives me the impression that it's not a social call, it's a business call. And, maybe he's scouting this guy, maybe he's got some conversations that need to be had with the people of their Top Rank to see about could be a rematch between them. And I very much like the proposition of that. Over time as a boxing fan, I've grown quite pessimistic, quite cynical, and I'd lost almost all hope that Naoya would get an opportunity to unify a third title in this division. This is a silver lining.
Does me hope that Nonito Donaire will not play the childish games we've been seeing from John Riel Casimero. That if he's here for vengeance. He's here for a second fight.
Maybe the people over there at the PBC thought Nonito would look to unify with the winner of Casimero versus Rigondeaux, but maybe there's more in it for Nonito in having a second fight with Naoya Inoue, who's a bigger name than the both of those other guys.
Here's to hoping we get the rematch.
And finally, in heavyweight news per tweet from Michael Benson, Andy Ruiz Jr. has named Luis Ortiz and Dillian Whyte as potential opponents for his next fight. And I won't be cavalier, I won't be brash, I won't be presumptuous, because there is reason enough to believe that Andy could actually end up fighting either of those guys. The probability for him to fight Dillian, it's about the same as the probability for him to fight Luis Ortiz. You have to understand something.
What?
Both of those fights are risky fights for this new and improved, quote-unquote improved, streamlined Andy Ruiz Jr. Andy Ruiz, who was last in action against Chris Arreola, and that fight, whilst entertaining, did not pan out the way that everybody thought it was going to pan out. Everybody thought that Andy Ruiz Jr. was going to make short work of Chris Arreola, and that's not what happened. Chris Arreola actually ended up dropping Andy Ruiz Jr., and we've often talked about why here on the channel, that, Andy losing that weight, trying to become more fit and trim, he's lost that shock absorber around his neck. That would prevent his head, his brain,
From jostling.
under his skull, from jostling if he absorbs a hard shot. He's a smaller guy, not as sturdy, whilst he's cutting weight, attempting to become more athletic, more streamlined. The thing is, Luis Ortiz, under these circumstances, maybe he is a risky opponent for Andy Ruiz Jr., because this ain't the Andy that fought Anthony Joshua the first time out. This is supposed to be a new and improved Andy, if you want to consider him new and improved. But one way or another, it's not the same guy. This is a guy who in his last fight got dropped by a very past it, albeit game, Chris Arreola. And if Chris can drop you, what can Luis Ortiz do to you? What can Dillian Whyte do to you? That's the situation. It's possible that the people over there at the PBC decide to keep everything in-house the way they usually keep everything in-house, and they decide to make Ruiz Jr. versus Luis Ortiz as a Fox pay-per-view. It's possible that things happen that way, but I'd wager that there's actually more money in it for Andy when it comes to a Dillian Whyte fight than a Luis Ortiz fight. You have to understand, Luis Ortiz, he doesn't have fans.
He doesn't.
The only guys that talk him up are Deontay Wilder's core supporters for Deontay having beaten Luis Ortiz, having fought him 2 times. Moreover, the second time that Deontay Wilder fought Luis Ortiz, those guys didn't put up astronomical pay-per-view buys, did they?
No.
So for Andy, who has even less of a following here today than Deontay Wilder does, what are the odds that you score a big payday with a Luis Ortiz pay-per-view? Neither one of yous is a big attraction. Whereas with Dillian, they already offered Andy Ruiz Jr. $4 million last year to fight Dillian Whyte. Now that the crowds are back and there's actually live gate revenue that can be generated, that fight might be worth even more money for Andy Ruiz Jr. Thus, there's a genuine possibility that he fights Dillian or he fights Luis Ortiz. Neither option would surprise me. Do I like one fight more than the other? I do. I like Dillian Whyte versus Andy Ruiz Jr. a lot more than I like Luis Ortiz versus Andy Ruiz Jr., though in truth, if he decides to go with Luis Ortiz, I won't complain.
Well, that depends.
Luis Ortiz would be a step up from the last guy that Andy Ruiz Jr. fought. That's true. I think it is an interesting situation. I think it is an intriguing fight. That is true as well. However, should that really be billed as a pay-per-view? Because if they make it, in all likelihood, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be a pay-per-view. Should you have to pay $80 to see that? That's the question. When you could watch Andy Ruiz Jr. versus Dillian Whyte as part of your DAZN subscription. In that situation, my issue wouldn't be the opponent. My issue would be the price tag, because if they had the nerve to put Ruiz versus Arreola on pay-per-view, you can bet your bottom dollar they'd do the same thing with this.
It's a solid fight.
Don't get me wrong, it is, but when you're getting Charlo versus Castaño at no additional charge on regular Showtime, why the hell should you have to pay $80 to see Ortiz versus Ruiz on Fox?